Hi, I'm Delaney, and the day I lost my job, I didn't just lose a paycheck, I lost my entire family. It happened on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where even the sky feels like it's holding its breath. I walked into the office, coffee in hand, and walked out an hour later with a cardboard box, two pens, and a severance envelope. The company downsized. My department was cut. Just like that, 5 years of late nights, unpaid overtime, and missed holidays. Gone. No warning, no mercy. I didn't cry in the elevator. I waited until I was back in my apartment sitting on the floor, staring at my diploma on the wall. Summa cum laude, like it meant anything now. The first person I called was my dad. Growing up, my father, Frank Delaney, was a man who spoke in expectations, not encouragement. Failure wasn't a lesson, it was a stain. And I knew calling him after a layoff was risky, but part of me still hoped maybe he'd surprise me. Maybe he'd say, "It happens, you'll get through this." He didn't. When he answered, I heard voices in the background. Probably my brothers over for dinner, the usual family gathering I hadn't been invited to in months. "Dad," I said, voice already breaking, "I lost my job today." Silence. Then, "I told you that company was unstable. You should have gone into finance like your brother." I started to explain, to say it wasn't performance related, that I had options, but he cut me off. "You're 32, Delaney. You're too old for these reinvention stories. You've always been too idealistic. That's your problem." I said nothing, and then he muttered, almost to himself but loud enough for me to hear, "He's a disgrace. We need to cut him off." He. That's what made it worse. For years, my father never quite knew what to do with a daughter who didn't wear pearls or marry up. He treated me like a boy who disappointed him and a girl he didn't understand. My name, Delaney, was unisex, and in business, I let people assume I was male if it helped me get through the door. I didn't mind, but hearing my father say he, like I was just a failed son, not a discarded daughter, broke something inside me. The call ended with no offer of help, no concern, just, "You'll figure it out, or you won't, but don't bring your problems here." The next day, my cousin texted me, "Hey, sorry to hear about the job. Uncle Frank said you're taking time to reflect?" Everyone's worried. Worried? They weren't worried. They were writing the narrative before I even had a chance to speak. By the end of the week, I was removed from the family group chat. My siblings stopped replying. My aunt sold a few things I left at her place during a move, things I'd been meaning to collect. She messaged me, "Since no one knew when you'd bounce back, we figured you didn't need them anymore." They called it tough love. It felt like exile. I sat in my apartment surrounded by silence and boxes I couldn't afford to move. Every plan I had, every spreadsheet, promotion goal, long-term vision was gone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing I'd been disposable, not just to the company that laid me off, but to the family that raised me. I stopped trying to reach out. I stopped sending updates. I stopped justifying my existence to people who needed a title next to my name to consider me worthy. They had sold off my belongings like garage sale leftovers and blocked me like I was a virus. And I stopped calling them family. I sat in that quiet, bitter place for weeks, jobless, heartbroken, and completely alone. But silence has a strange way of turning into resolve. Because in that stillness, I made myself a promise. They would remember the name they buried, and the next time they heard it, it would echo. Not as a disappointment, but as the name on the door. And the name at the head of the table. I wish I could say I rose from the ashes right away, that I woke up the next morning with a plan and a fire in my chest. But the truth is, I didn't even get out of bed the next day, or the one after. I stayed in that apartment, curtains drawn, lights off, watching the sunlight crawl across the walls and disappear again. I didn't shower, I didn't answer texts. I let my phone die, and for once I didn't bother reviving it. No one called anyway. I had no job, no savings to last more than a few months, and no one to lean on. I had always prided myself on being the one who didn't need help. I was the fixer, the one who sent money to cousins quietly, helped friends prep for job interviews, and supported coworkers when they crumbled. I was the support system. Now I had none. And in the stillness of that realization, I broke. I remember one day in particular. I'd scraped together enough coins to get a cheap sandwich and sat alone in a nearly empty cafe, my first time outside in over a week. A young couple sat at the next table, laughing over matching laptops. A mother fed her toddler while scrolling through job listings on her phone. Life was moving on, and I felt like I was frozen in place. I blinked away tears and asked myself, what am I even good at anymore? My degree? Useless if no one would hire me. My experience? Apparently disposable. My family? Gone. But then a tiny voice inside me whispered something different. You're still here. That thought startled me. Because yes, everything had crumbled. But I hadn't. Not entirely. I walked back home and pulled out a dusty notebook I used to journal in, back when I had dreams instead of lists of failures. I started writing down everything I was still capable of doing, every skill, every connection, every idea I had ever put on hold. I made a list titled, Things I Was Told Weren't Good Enough. Learning to code, writing copy, creating strategy decks, consulting for startups, public speaking, running operations, teaching others. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was mine. That night, I dug out an old email from a community startup I'd volunteered for years ago. They were offering a 6-month mentorship in digital business management and entrepreneurship. It wasn't glamorous and it didn't pay, but it gave access to training, tools, and most importantly, people who believed in building something from nothing. I applied at 2 a.m. I didn't tell anyone. What was there to tell? My family had already rewritten my identity as a failure. I figured they could keep that version of me, tucked away in their smug little circle. Meanwhile, I got accepted into the program. They called me the next week. A woman named Jayla, my soon-to-be mentor, spoke to me with warmth, curiosity, and zero judgment. She didn't ask why I was jobless. She asked what I wanted to build. That question felt foreign. No one had asked what I wanted in years. The next few months were brutal. I worked part-time at a bookstore by day and took virtual classes at night. I barely slept. I clipped coupons like my life depended on it. I watched my old friends post photos from rooftop bars while I ate ramen and watched YouTube tutorials about scaling online businesses. But slowly, something started to change. I stopped waking up afraid. I started waking up focused. And one night, as I reviewed a case study for a project, I remembered something my father once said to me after I got a promotion in my old job. That's good, but it's still not impressive enough to put next to our name. He said it with a smirk, like it was meant to push me forward. But that night, I wrote something different in my journal. I'm not chasing our name anymore. I'm building my own. That was the moment I stopped surviving and started building. They had blocked me out of their world, so I decided I'd create one where their approval meant absolutely nothing. The next 6 months didn't look like redemption. They looked like grit. My mornings started with black coffee and a checklist. I worked part-time at the bookstore from 7 a.m. to noon, stacking novels written by people who had turned pain into prose. In the afternoons, I studied management theory, market positioning, UX design. In the evenings, I joined Zoom sessions with my mentorship cohort, a group of scrappy dreamers from across the country who, like me, were clawing their way back from rock bottom. No one in that group knew my past. No one knew about the father who discarded me like a stock that didn't perform. No one asked about my last job title or my GPA. They just saw what I was building. It started as a simple idea: create a consulting firm that helped startups organize their chaos. Most new ventures had ideas, but no systems, no structure, no strategy. I could do that. I had done that before, for free, for friends, for companies that never appreciated it. This time, I would do it on my terms. Jayla, my mentor, was the first to say the words that had been sitting unspoken in my chest. You've been underestimated your whole life, but you are quietly, relentlessly powerful. That's your edge. I didn't cry when she said it, but later that night, I stared at my reflection in the mirror and whispered to myself, you don't need to prove them wrong. You need to prove you were always right to believe in yourself. And I did. I built a website using free templates. I cold emailed 20 founders I'd met at old conferences. Two replied. One gave me a chance. It was a small gig, organizing workflows for a fintech startup barely out of beta testing, but I treated it like $1 million account. I showed up early to every call, delivered ahead of schedule, caught issues they hadn't even spotted yet. When they closed their first round of funding, the CEO gave me a shout out on LinkedIn. That post? It changed everything. Suddenly, I was getting messages from founders asking for help. Companies who couldn't afford full-time COOs but needed someone to build systems, manage scale, clean up their mess. I became that person. Behind the scenes, efficient, professional, anonymous at first. I was making more money in 1 month than I used to make in 2. And still I didn't tell anyone. Because I wasn't doing this for applause. I was doing it for the version of me who sat alone in a dark apartment, wondering if she had anything left to offer. Eventually, the consulting firm became a full-time operation. I hired 2 assistants, then a third. We rebranded, built a team. Clients began referring to me by a title I hadn't used before, founder and CEO. The funny thing was, my father still had no idea. He thought I'd vanished into obscurity, probably whispered behind my back at family dinners. Poor Delaney, such a waste of potential. Maybe he still told the story of how I chose the wrong path or refused to listen. I let him, because I was too busy building an empire out of everything he said I lacked. But then one day, an opportunity came that felt different, big. A potential merger that could push my firm into international operations. We were invited to the negotiation table with a much larger corporation. I scanned the invite, reviewed the attendees, prepped my notes, and that's when I saw it. Frank Delaney, my father, executive advisor, listed on the other side. I stared at the name until it blurred. I read it again and again. He was walking into my space now. The man who once said I was a disgrace was coming to pitch to a company led by the daughter he discarded. He didn't know, but he would. And not because I'd raise my voice or throw my success in his face, but because this time, when he walked into the room, I would be the one sitting at the head of the table. The night I saw his name on the agenda, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, phone on my chest, screen glowing with that one name, Frank Delaney, under the list of confirmed attendees for our upcoming strategy session with Cormier Group, one of the fastest scaling enterprise tech consultancies in the country. That was his company. I'd heard of it before. I just hadn't realized they were involved in the same circles now. I had grown so focused on building my own thing in my own world that I hadn't even considered we might collide. But there it was. He was scheduled to walk into my boardroom, sit across from my team, and present a proposal to my company, and he had no idea. I told no one on my staff, not Jayla, not my assistants, not the clients we were preparing to expand with. This moment wasn't about public validation. This wasn't something I wanted sympathy for. This was between me and the man who once said, "We don't have room in this family for failure." And I had been that failure. I spent the following days preparing not just for the deal, but for him. I practiced my voice, level, composed, not a trace of emotion. I rewrote my intro script. Normally, I let my chief of operations handle meeting openings. Not this time. This time, I wanted my name to be the first thing he heard. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed like armor. Not overly styled, not flashy, but commanding. Black suit, crisp blouse, minimal jewelry. I pinned my hair back tightly, neutral lipstick. Not because I needed to look the part, but because I was the part. CEO, founder, leader, the woman he underestimated. I arrived early, an old habit. The conference room was pristine. The team had laid out the binders, set up the presentation on the big screen, and placed my name card at the head of the table. Delaney Carter, Chief Executive Officer. The others began filing in. My team, polite and poised, unaware of the storm about to enter. Then the other company's delegation arrived, 3 men, 1 woman. I rose to greet them, shaking hands firmly, and then he walked in, Frank Delaney. He looked exactly the same, expensive suit, controlled stride, a face aged by ambition and superiority. He smiled, nodded toward the room, and casually looked up. And saw me. He blinked once, then twice. The smile didn't fall immediately. It froze, like his brain was catching up with reality. His eyes dropped to the placard. then to my face, then back to the placard again. I held my hand out. Mr. Delaney, I said calmly, thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing your proposal. He hesitated just a second too long, then shook my hand like it burned him. You're, he began, his voice quieter now. You're Delaney? I am. I sat at the head of the table. He stood there, clearly flustered. His assistant motioned to an open chair. He didn't sit, not immediately. I could feel the tension ripple around the room, though no one else knew the full story. He tried to recover, tried to smile, but he kept glancing at me like I was a ghost. And I understood then. He thought I had disappeared. He believed the version of the story he told others, that I had faded into failure, vanished into bitterness, just like he warned I would. He never imagined I'd be the one holding the pen this time. I opened the meeting without skipping a beat. We'll begin with a 10-minute overview of our current structure and how your firm aligns with our growth trajectory. After that, we'll review proposals and long-term collaboration strategies. My voice was even, my hands steady, my face unreadable. His team began presenting. I listened, asked sharp questions, took notes. All the while, my father sat across from me, sweating under the collar of his tailored suit. At one point, our eyes met, and I saw it. Recognition, regret, and something else. Fear, not fear of me, but fear of what it meant to have discarded someone this capable. And I didn't flinch, because this time I didn't need his approval. I didn't need his praise. All I needed was for him to witness that the daughter he erased had become the woman he now had to answer to. The meeting carried on, slide after slide, projections, graphs, buzzwords tossed around like confetti. But all I could focus on was the way my father kept shifting in his seat, fidgeting with his pen, clearing his throat, tugging at the cuffs of his designer shirt like they were suddenly too tight. He wasn't used to being the one under scrutiny. He was used to leading the room. Now he was being evaluated, and I was the one making the call. I watched him try to gather himself, like a man rehearsing his lines in a play he didn't know I had written. He was clearly trying to regain footing. He pitched hard, talked about synergy, scalability, legacy systems, his decades of experience, but it didn't land like it used to, because he wasn't talking to a room of yes men anymore. He was talking to me, and I had heard it all before, at our dinner table across from him in high school debates, in his voice echoing down the phone line when he said, "You're not worth our time until you've accomplished something." Well, here I was, sitting at the head of the table, his audience, his judge. When the pitch wrapped, there was a pause. His team looked pleased with themselves. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and finally looked me in the eye. "Well," he said with a forced smile, "what do you think, Delaney?" I closed the binder slowly. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit. He needed to feel it. Then I folded my hands and said evenly, "Your proposal is polished, but I'm not sure your company's values align with ours." That sentence hit harder than any insult I could have delivered. His smile wavered. "Excuse me?" he said. I gestured to the whiteboard behind me. "We operate from transparency, mentorship, equity, especially when it comes to how we treat team members during vulnerable transitions. I'm not confident your firm aligns with that culture." He blinked. "Our numbers speak for themselves." "I'm sure they do," I replied, "but I'm not interested in numbers without integrity." The word hung in the air like a blade. He knew exactly what I meant. The room went still. He shifted forward, now leaning in. "Delaney, look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot." "No," I interrupted, calm but direct. "We didn't get off on the wrong foot. You just didn't recognize the ground you were walking on." I stood, walked slowly to the window, then turned around and said, "Let's be honest, Mr. Delaney. You didn't just misjudge me. You discarded me. And now you're back at the table not because you see my worth, but because you need something from me." He looked stunned. His team glanced at each other, unsure if this was still part of the pitch or something far more personal. And then I said the line I'd waited years to say, "You block me from your life, but today I'm blocking your business from mine?" His jaw tightened. "You're letting personal feelings interfere with business." "No," I said, walking back to my chair. "I'm letting personal experience guide better business." I tapped my fingers on the binder. You taught me something valuable, though. You taught me how to stand alone. You just never imagined I'd rise higher than you. He stood up abruptly. This is a mistake. I stood up too. Maybe, but it's mine to make. Just like you made yours. I nodded to the rest of his team, who were now staring at me like they had just watched a man dethroned. Thank you all for your time, I said professionally. We won't be moving forward. And then I turned to leave. No drama, no gloating, just finality. Because I didn't need to slam a door to make a point. The door had been closed years ago. Now I was the one who locked it. And I didn't leave a key under the mat. I walked out of that room taller than I'd ever felt. Not because I had humiliated my father, not because I had rejected his proposal, but because for once I hadn't shrunk to make him feel comfortable. I didn't flinch. I didn't fold. I didn't ask for understanding. I simply showed him what he missed out on. By the time I returned to my office, my team was already buzzing. Wow, you really kept it cool, one of my project leads said. That guy? He didn't expect to be questioned like that. Another added, was he someone you knew? You seemed like you really knew how to handle him. I smiled, not bitter, not smug, just free. I've had a lot of practice, I said, then turned the conversation back to business. No one needed to know the whole story, because the power in that moment wasn't just in what I said, it was in what I didn't say. He came to me seeking approval, opportunity, and access, and I gave him exactly what he gave me years ago. Nothing. I didn't expect to hear from him again. But 2 days later, a letter arrived, delivered by hand, signed with his familiar handwriting. Delaney, I never imagined I'd walk into that room and see you there. I also never imagined the person I pushed aside would become the one I'd have to answer to. I won't pretend I handled things well. I thought I was protecting the family name. But what I did was erase my own daughter because I couldn't control her path. That was cowardice. You don't owe me anything. But I owe you this. I was wrong. Dad. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time, not because it healed anything, but because it confirmed what I already knew. It was never about me being unworthy. It was about them being uncomfortable with my independence. For years, I thought I had to earn their love, that if I worked hard enough, made enough money, brought home the right accolades, I'd finally be welcomed back in. But love with conditions isn't love, it's a performance, and I'd stepped off that stage. After that day, something interesting happened. People from the family I hadn't heard from in years started popping back up. A cousin sent a vague, "Hey, how are you?" message. An aunt who once told me I just didn't have the drive left a comment on one of my press features. So proud of you. But I didn't answer, because I wasn't building bridges anymore. I was building boundaries. And then one weekend, Jayla called me. You good? She asked. I read the report. Looks like you turned down a multi-million-dollar partnership. I did, I said. Wasn't the right fit. She paused, then said, You know, I think the strongest people aren't the ones who seek revenge. They're the ones who don't need it. That stuck with me, because I had spent so many years hoping for that one moment, that perfect cinematic confrontation where they'd all finally see my worth. But when it came, I didn't need the fireworks. I didn't crave his apology. I didn't even want him to say he was proud of me. I had already given myself everything he refused to: validation, pride, peace. The irony? He finally saw my title, but he'll never know who I became outside of it. I was no longer just a CEO. I was a woman who had lost everything and used the silence to rebuild her entire identity. And this time, no one gets to define me but me. A few weeks after the meeting, I cleared out the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside it sat a small, faded photo I hadn't looked at in years. Me at age 7, standing beside my father in the garage, holding a wrench like it was a scepter. We'd been fixing something together. I don't remember what. Maybe it was a lie even then. Him trying to perform fatherhood for my brothers while letting me tag along. Back then, I thought we were close. But when I looked at that photo now, I didn't see connection. I saw a child who was trying to earn a place, trying to become someone he could respect. I smiled softly, folded the photo back into its envelope, and tucked it away. Not out of grief, but out of release. That little girl wasn't chasing approval anymore. She had become the woman no one saw coming. My firm was expanding faster than I ever imagined. New partnerships were forming, real ones, built on shared values, not desperation. We hired 10 new team members, launched a mentorship wing to support young professionals rebuilding after layoffs, and started hosting workshops for women in male-dominated industries. I named the initiative Second Row Rising, a quiet tribute to the years I'd spent sitting behind the scenes, waiting for my turn to be seen. And now? I was making room for others to step into the light sooner than I ever could. One of our new interns, Alyssa, reminded me of myself at 22. She was brilliant, ambitious, but nervous to speak up in meetings. "You're allowed to take up space," I told her one day as we walked out of a pitch session. "Not everyone will give it to you. Sometimes you have to build it yourself." She smiled at me like I'd handed her a compass. That was the legacy I wanted. Not a name printed on a product line or a plaque on a wall, but a ripple. A signal to other women like me. You are not what they said you were. You are more. I no longer needed family dinners where I played a role to keep the peace. I no longer checked my father's social media to see if maybe, just maybe, he'd posted something kind about me. I no longer cared. I created new traditions, new circles, new family made up of colleagues who toasted my wins, friends who remembered my birthday without reminders, and clients who trusted me not because of my title, but because I showed up every time with honesty and clarity. Eventually, my story became more than just a story. It became a quiet movement. I was invited to speak at conferences, share panels with women I used to admire from a distance. A podcast interview I did went viral. What to do when the people who raised you don't respect who you became. In that interview, I said something I hadn't fully realized until the moment it left my mouth. We think family is forever, but sometimes family is just the first set of people who teach you how to survive. It doesn't mean they get to decide your worth. That line was shared over 50,000 times. I received emails from people I didn't know, thanking me for saying what they had never been able to. One woman wrote, "I saw myself in every word, and for the first time I realized I'm not broken. I was just waiting for the wrong people to notice." I wept when I read that, because I had spent years begging my family to notice me. And now, I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I wasn't waiting at all. I had become the woman I needed to be, not for them, not for revenge, but for that girl with the wrench in her hand hoping to be enough. She was enough. She always had been. And now, she had finally been heard by the one person whose voice mattered most, her own. Months passed. The incident with my father faded from daily thought, like a bruise that still tingled when touched but no longer ached constantly. Life moved forward. My company was thriving. I started sleeping better, eating better, laughing more. And not the polite kind of laugh you give when you want to fit in, but the kind that lives in your chest, the kind you forget you're allowed to have. Then came the day I saw him again. Unexpected, unplanned. I was speaking at a leadership summit, one of those sleek events in a luxury hotel ballroom where the chairs were white leather and the water came in glass bottles with lime wedges. My talk was scheduled for mid-afternoon. I walked on stage to polite applause, not nervous this time, just ready. My slides were simple. My words were clear. I told the truth. I talked about rebuilding after rejection, about finding power in silence and choosing to make peace with your past, not by going back to it, but by outgrowing it entirely. I said, sometimes the people who gave you your name don't deserve to be part of the name you build for yourself. And that's okay. Let them remember the version of you they threw away, while you rise. When I walked off stage, I shook hands, smiled for photos, collected a few business cards. Then, as I turned to leave, I saw him, Frank Delaney, my father, standing alone near the back exit, dressed in the same navy suit he always wore when he wanted to appear impressive. He looked smaller now, or maybe I had just grown so far past him that he no longer loomed the way he used to. He didn't approach, just stood there, holding a brochure, eyes fixed on me like he was trying to memorize someone he'd never bothered to really know. We locked eyes. He opened his mouth, and I did something I never thought I'd be able to do. I smiled, not cold, not smug, just kind. But I didn't walk over. I didn't know him that. He had already walked away once, years ago, when I needed support, when I needed a father. And now, standing in the presence of the woman I had become, he was the one left unsure of his place. That was his ending, not mine. I turned and walked away, not to punish him, but to honor myself, because I didn't come all this way just to hand back the power I fought to reclaim. Outside, the sun was warm, the street was buzzing, and as I climbed into the back of my ride and closed the door, I felt something settle, not closure, but wholeness. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no movie-perfect hug, just a truth that no longer stung. He didn't have to change for me to heal. Because I wasn't the girl he left behind anymore. I was the CEO he never saw coming, the voice he couldn't silence, the legacy he could no longer control. And somewhere inside him, he knew it. The look on his face said everything. She made it, without me, despite me, and there's no seat left at her table.